Well, thanks to all three speakers for very interesting talks. And we have time for questions. Don't be shy.
Tend to be on a one-track mind, but Professor Filk, the extended now, there's the measurement of the extended now, which milliseconds, you said, but then there's the measurer, the one who's doing the measurement. Now, isn't the extended now predicated on the now of the measurer, which can't be measured? It's a predication that there is somebody in some kind of an immediate state that's measuring a now that can be measured. So aren't there at least two nows?
Yeah. Let's see. Does that work? Oh, yes. Of course, when I say there's an extended now, and then I quote a number like 500 milliseconds, then you can ask the question, well, obviously this system itself could not measure these 500 milliseconds. So in physics, of course, what you do is then you compare with a system which is not considered, at least on this level, as behaving as a quantum system. So we have clocks which can be very accurate, which can be accurate, let's say, to the 10 to the minus 9 or 10 to the minus 10 seconds, or even more accurate. And then we use this external clock to compare with the process which happens in a quantum system. And in these quantum systems, you can in principle have nows which are extended with respect to our clocks for almost an infinity. Billions of years. Nice examples from John Wheeler, who had these billions of years delayed choice experiments. So in these systems, within the system, you do not have a clock which can measure any sequence. That's more or less the statement. Outside, when you compare, then yes, you have.
But isn't there still the predication that some measurement of some kind of the duration, you use the word duration, is based on something that is happening in the experimenter's state, which, in other words, one is predicated on the now of the experimenter? Somebody is doing the observation. Isn't there...
Yes, but it's not this somebody who measures this time in his or her consciousness, but he or she uses a device, and she just reads off the device. And that is accurate to, let's say, 10 to the minus 9 seconds or so. So I wouldn't go that far.
Okay, thanks.
Do you want to comment?
I'm very confused by this. Well, this is supposed to work. That's why. Does it work? Yeah. Okay. Now, I'm very confused by all this because my understanding of quantum mechanics is that there is a well-defined now, a universal clock. It's just like in Newtonian theory, and there's no uncertainty or anything about it. You can make measurements, and sure, but there's a Schrödinger equation just ticks away according to a universal clock. Of course, if you bring relativity into the picture, then that's a different story. But quantum mechanics, the state just, I don't quite understand the issue that's being, I don't understand your point of view, but that's certainly not my point of view.
Maybe I should clarify. What I mean is that during these processes, there is no internal clock which measures it. As you said, you might have always this universal clock in the background with respect to which you can measure events, and then you can say it happened at this and that time. But we know that within the system, in order to define a clock, for instance, you cannot take an eigenstate of the Hamiltonian because they don't experience any duration. They are static. They don't change. So for me, a clock should be part of the system. So let's say my definition of time here is more related to what Einstein said when he said time is what you measure on the clock. So the problem is, what are the clocks which I use in order to measure duration or time? And if I'm requiring that a clock is part of the system, so within the quantum system, then these processes have a duration in which, let's say, causal ordering, one before the other, is not defined.
Well, that's a different view from what I have. I don't.
Back
I
there?
mean, there are lots of other uncertainties in quantum mechanics, but I didn't think time was one of them. In standard quantum mechanics, not quantum field theory, not relativity, that's another issue. I mean, time just ticks away, and you have a state which... I mean, you're talking about internal clocks or something, but I'm not sure what they are. The theory, there's an absolute notion of time, which is external, if you like, but you may measure that or you may not. Anyway, sorry, I shouldn't. I should leave it to somebody else.
Thanks. A question for Dr. Fuchs. You appear to be defining your physics in terms of experience, which seems a very satisfactory way of doing things. Would it be fair to say that a physical event is of a type that can belong to a chain of similar events of a similar type, which if you put a human being, which is another cluster of physical events, in the right place, in the right context, you can predict a certain experience, which would suggest that the philosophical zombie is a contradiction because it's not physical?
I'm not completely sure I understood what you were saying, but let me outline something that might be relevant to what you're asking. So in the philosophy of William James, he tried to construct, or he has two very late papers, one of them titled Consciousness Does Not Exist, and one of them titled A World of Pure Experience. And he posits that the stuff of the world is what he called experience. And he went to pains to explain that experience was neither material nor mental, but when put in association with other experiences, would take on the one characteristic, mental, say, or the other characteristic, material, and perhaps any number of other attributes in between and in other dimensions as well. So I think the thing that Cubism is pointing to is that these happenings that are the outcomes of quantum measurements are of this kind of character. They're neither mental nor they're physical. When one thinks in the context of quantum theory, one clearly has an observer on one side of the story and an external physical system on the other. But the idea is to abstract those two poles away and be left with the event itself. And along the lines of James, I think that it's neither material nor mental, but that does not make it beyond the reach of physics. The reach of physics comes in when we write down equations that say how best to gamble in light of a world of this character.
Yeah, I would agree with that. That wasn't really my point, but it's just a technical thing as to whether a philosophical zombie is actually a contradiction in terms, but never mind.
Well, maybe try to explain it to me later when I have more time to think on what you're... Now you can't be heard.
Okay, later.
Yes, my question to Thomas about the last, part of conclusions. So, about your idea to relax with definitions. It looks like the definition will define the theory the same way as contextuality you described. So, isn't it just an attempt to escape the responsibility of observer to stop to define clearly? Because you understand that definition will really define what will happen afterwards.
Yeah, well, my point was that we cannot define the concept of charge without referring to how we measure it. So if you're looking for what is the ontology of what is reality here, what is charge in reality, I must say I don't know what it is. I know how it interacts, how systems which are charged interact with other. I know what to observe when an object is charged. So I define charge by a certain measurement procedure. And even though I don't know what it is as in any ontology, I can make myself an ontology, but that's irrelevant. And so I think this happens very often in physics. I was quite astonished, at least when I thought about it, that even such common concepts like energy or so, actually, I mean, there are mathematical definitions, but they depend on the model which you use. But in a particular measurement, of course, it's also the model which tells you, in principle, what do you measure. But, I mean, I define then a certain quantity by the reaction or the experimental signature which I see. I mean, that's how the elementary particles are measured, let's say, at CERN or so. They measure certain properties by using certain devices, and then they define, okay, now we have observed an electron, now we have observed a positron, and so on. But what an electron is, let's say in any philosophical sense or so, I must say I don't know. I don't know whether that answers.
But when you measure, you measure according some definitions anyway. You can't escape definitions fully.
I need these definitions, otherwise I cannot come up with a theory which produces numbers in the end. And that's the advantage, that the theory doesn't depend on me knowing exactly what the ontology or so of charge is. For the theory, it's sufficient to know how charge is measured.
My question, if you will say that the theory and result of measurement is dependent definition, maybe it will be like more clear and not
well, of course, I mean,
definitions.
if I make different definitions, then in the same experiment, I can say I observe different quantities. We have examples of this where, let's say, we observe something, we measure certain quantities, and now it depends on the theory whether, for instance, I have measured a force or whether I have measured the curvature of the universe.
In the back.
Hi there. I'd like you to explain the observer thing to me. So, as an example, with deep field view of the universe, do you guys believe that when the light goes into the Hubble telescope and then a conscious human looks at that photo, that the galaxies 10 billion light years away somehow collapsed and came into existence through the active observation that has happened in a laboratory on Earth? Or do you believe that the whole universe is actually out there, or it actually does require an observer to view it, to collapse a wave function and create existence? I find it a really strange concept.
Who were you addressing with your question?
Oh, so just a general question, so just general quantum question.
I'll take my shot. I didn't much understand what you were saying. I had trouble with your accents. I apologize.
Sorry.
Well, I think you were asking, does the active observation create faraway galaxies?
Yeah.
And of course, that perhaps depends upon your interpretation of quantum mechanics. I can speak for myself in saying that I well believe that there is stuff going on behind the moon. I believe there is stuff happening far away. There were things happening 13 billion years ago. Things were happening all the time. Then, in my own point of view, in the point of view of cubism, is to say things were happening, things are happening all around us all the time. But quantum mechanics isn't directly about that. Quantum mechanics instead is how I can best survive in a world where things are happening in certain ways. So by this light, what about the wave function at the beginning of the universe? Well, there was no wave function. A wave function is not a real thing in this point of view. Things were happening, but there were no wave functions. Things were happening in 1924 here on Earth, but there were no wave functions. It was only when we had a good idea for how to better handle our physical experiments in early 1926 that wave functions came into existence. So from this point of view, it's not about faraway galaxies coming into existence, but when do wave functions come into existence?
Okay.
And I would say wave functions don't come into existence until there's somebody using them.
Okay, so you do believe in independent external reality?
No, I keep independent external reality. It's not identified with wave functions.
Okay.
Wave functions are to do with a calculus for making decisions. One needs a decision maker. One needs some entity that is sufficiently educated to use the methods of quantum mechanics.
But is
But the
that-
world is still there.
Yeah, okay, yeah, so... But you guys don't believe in, like, a universal observer. If you have a premise of an observer, it seems to me, if everything has to be observed to exist, the only way that can be is if there's a universal observer. It seems like you're believing God, basically. It seems like a absolutely illogical premise.
Thomas will answer why that's
So-
wrong.
Yeah, I don't believe that, but...
Why should I? I mean, I have the same problem with you. I'm sorry. Maybe commenting more on what Chris said. In my language, I would say interactions have always been, since the beginning of the universe, systems have interacted, and this interaction determined to a certain degree then what happens. And what in quantum theory is so special that I, as an experimentalist maybe, I make a decision what kind of experiment to make. So I make a decision whether I make this interaction with the quantum system or whether I make a different interaction with the quantum system. And this decision has an influence on what happens then. And I think this is not something special. What is special is that when I make a decision and say, okay, I put my polarizing beam splitter or whatever here in this position, that then something comes out which was not determined in the sense of elements of physical reality, which Chris mentioned. There was no element of physical reality which determined whether the photon will go left or right. But it's my decision to make observations which influence the reality. And I think from a social point of view, again, I would argue that's the same in psychology, that's the same in social sciences. When a psychotherapist makes a decision to ask a certain question to his or her patient, that has a big influence maybe on the way how the rest of the therapy works. So that is not something that we can say. I wouldn't say that implies there were no galaxies before there was humanity.
So is it right to think quantum theory is the interaction of consciousness with independent external reality?
That depends a little bit on your interpretation. There are people who would say yes, I don't say no.
Right, okay.
I do say no.
Thank you.
Roger, do you want to comment?
Yeah, I guess my point of view with regard to quantum mechanics seems to be very different from that of my fellow panelists here. I mean, it seems to be conveyed as some kind of rather wishy-washy thing, which depending on the observers and things like that. Whereas the view I have of quantum mechanics is a very precise theory, and it has to be. We know it's very precise, which describes how the state evolves. So if you like, the Schrödinger equation. And it's very precise. The only trouble is that when you have some kind of object which is too macroscopic in some sense, then it seems to not follow this equation. And that's what's called the collapse of the wave function. So you have the wave function evolves very precisely according to Schrödinger's equation. But then you bring in something which is called a measuring device. And then for some reason that's big enough that it doesn't actually... You see, in the Schrödinger equation you have particles in lots of places at the same time, and that's what happens. The quantum state describes what's called an amplitude for it to be in each place. It's not a probability. That's something which I worried about in your description, that you could apparently talk about the different probabilities. It's more than that. It's probabilities, and there's what's called a phase as well. So you have to know that phase as well, and the this is what you call an amplitude. So it's not just that the thing is here with a certain probability or here with a certain probability. It's got to have that phase as well. Okay, if you have all that, that's the state, according to the Schrödinger equation. But the trouble is, when you get some things which are too big, in a certain sense, it doesn't seem to follow this equation, and you get a jump from one state to another. And that was always a great puzzle to Schrödinger. He was very puzzled by this, because the physical state does not seem to evolve according to that very precise equation. But, I mean, there are ways of measuring the quantum state and get very precise agreement with the Schrödinger equation. There's no question about it. It's not a wishy-washy theory in some sense, in terms of everything is just probabilistically defined or something. It's very clear. The only thing which is not clear is where the theory seems to undergo these jumps. And that's when you make a measurement. And in the view I hold, which is the sort of thing I was very partially describing here, is that there is something else which comes in, and that comes in when you have too much mass displacement. And instead of remaining in a superposition of these two locations, it jumps to being one or the other. And that's what seems to happen in the world. And people will worry about that because they think, oh, that must be very subjective or something. Well, that's one view. But my own view is it's a very objective thing, but it just doesn't follow the Schrödinger equation. But if one talks about observers and what people think and measurements in terms of, I don't know, I just feel the theory gets too wishy-washy and you don't see the huge precision that's there in the theory. It's very, very precise. As long as one's talking about displacements which just don't get too big. And then you find the system flops into one or the other, which is this very mysterious collapse of the wave function, which needs a theory which we don't have as yet. But this, if you're looking at a small enough level, particles or whatever it is, then you don't have any problem with this. And there's no wishy-washiness about the time or about what the state is and how it evolves. It's very clear. It's just that when it gets too big and the superpositions get too big, and then you seem to have to jump from one state to another. And that's what's involved in making a measurement. You somehow magnify up these small quantum things up to a classical level, and then you have to make turns into probabilities. But at the quantum level, there aren't any probabilities. It all just follows this equation.
If I can give I'll try a brief response to Roger's choice of the word wishy-washy.
Sorry.
I like to give the example of, and sometimes in lectures, I walk into the lecture hall with a copy of Leonard J. Savage's book, The Foundations of Statistics. In this book, Savage gives a derivation of the rules of probability theory and of utility theory. He starts with a set of axioms, and then he fills in all of the various things he needs, and then he gives a derivation that the maximizing expected utility is the best way to proceed about your business. There's certainly nothing wishy-washy about developing decision theory from a number of precise axioms. Now, if you look into the same book and ask of this book, this user's manual, how do you define, if you look into the book and say, well, where's the chapter that defines exactly what it takes to be a user of decision theory, you won't find an answer. So similarly, I think of quantum theory in this way that I do. It is an addition to decision theory. And just as you can't look into a book on decision theory and find a precise definition of what it takes to be a user of decision theory, you're not going to be able to look within quantum theory and find a precise definition of what it takes to be a user of quantum theory. So at least from that perspective, I would say there's no wishy-washiness about this point of view, none that one wouldn't find in any development of decision theory. What it takes is for one to say, I'm going to stop thinking of physics as a direct description of what is exactly in the world, and instead take the point of view that quantum physics, at least, maybe not all of physics, but quantum physics is not a direct description of what's happening in the world, but a system for making better decisions in light of the world that you're in.
But I still worry about your comment about the probabilities defining the state. I mean, you need to know the amplitudes.
Yes.
The phases,
Actually,
yes.
this is very good. The last time we spoke, I think, was in 2012, and I posed a mathematical problem to you. You can find a formalism that is isomorphic to quantum theory that uses no complex numbers, only uses probability calculus. That depends upon a very special, you can do it. You can just do it. You can also make it pretty if a certain mathematical structure exists. And that's where I consulted with you. We'll talk about this later.
Yeah, perhaps we should leave it at this point. Yeah.
Over here, please.
Thank you. I'd like to delve further into the nature of these probabilities as statements of belief. So we know that if probabilities are a statement of what I believe to be possible and how likely, and when it comes to collapsing the wave function, one of those possibilities is chosen to be reality by something we might call proto-consciousness, then shouldn't I take the life advice that if I really believe, I put all my stake on jumping off a cliff and flying, that will be the one that happens? Or is there a different source of probability that is other than my belief?
I certainly don't follow that. I mean, it's not saying that it's... I simply don't follow the argument there. Why do you, if you believe you can fly, it doesn't make you able to fly? The belief is not the probability. I mean, that's a subjective. You might be completely wrong. You find you can't fly, so sorry, that was the wrong probability. But I don't quite see what that's got to do with quantum mechanics.
What would be the right probability then?
I'm sorry, did I misunderstand? Yeah. I mean, the probability there is a very subjective one. It's an opinion of what the likelihood is of something happening. Whereas quantum mechanics comes up with these very precise numbers. It doesn't tell you which of the alternative. When the state collapses, it might collapse this way or that way, and the probability is given as to whether how much more likely is that than that. That probability is defined by the theory, but that's the part which talks about the collapse. Now, there's no subjectiveness in that. It's just it's an inbuilt probability according to the theory. It's not anybody's opinion. And you can do measurements. You can set up the same experiment many, many times, and you get out the probability agree exactly with what quantum mechanics predicts. So I don't understand why it's got anything to do with the belief. Perhaps that's not what you're saying. Perhaps I misunderstood you.
That's the left side, from my point of view, the left side interpretation of this stage. The right side interpretation of this stage would say something like the following. If you start with a prior probability for probability of some hypothesis, and you also have a probability for the hypothesis given some data, a probability for a hypothesis and some data, then upon gathering some data, one would use Bayes' rule to update from the prior to the posterior. The posterior is completely determined by the conjunction of the prior and the data. So there's nothing imprecise about what one goes to at the next step, given what one had at the previous step. So the point of view on the right side here, your left side, is that a quantum state, so when Roger says these are very precise probabilities, I would say, well, a quantum state plays the role of a prior probability. And then the rules for updating quantum states is just like Bayes' rule. So given the prior and the data, one updates to a perfectly precise new quantum state. There's no wishy-washiness in that again. Now, actually, this is interesting. I don't know if you find it interesting, but in my early life, I started out as a Roger Penrosian. I had read The Emperor's New Mind, and I was blown away by it. And especially the idea that there were two kinds of evolution. There was U and R, and U was law-like, and R had a kind of element of freedom or randomness or free will or what have you. But it was based on making sense of the idea of objective chance. So when one specifies a quantum state and one specifies a measurement operator, there's no wiggle room. You can calculate a probability for the outcome of a measurement. And I thought, this is great. Now I've got to understand these objective chances. And I started exploring the path along frequentism, and that was full of contradictions. And then I started exploring the path of propensities, and I found that the extent to which one could make sense of propensities, one always relied on frequentism, and that was contradictory. So it was only after a long, long process that I came to the, I don't know if maybe Professor Penrose will say I gave up, but I gave up on objective chances and realized that the more sensible notion was the subjective notion, and that in fact, after quite a number of years, came to the appreciation that when one says the quantum in a textbook, assume the quantum state is this and the measurement operator is that, it's nothing more firm than in a statistics book where the problem says, suppose the prior is this and this kind of data is gathered, calculate the posterior.
All right, we have, looks like 7 questioners and just a couple minutes. Maybe we'll go a little extra, but please be brief, both the questioners and the panelists. Back there.
Thank you. I have a question to Dr. Fuchs. I think so 30 years ago, I had long discussions with Carl Friedrich von Weizsäcker about Definiti's conception of probability. So I want to ask you, also in the light of the lecture of Professor Filk, where are you the real differences between your concept and the normal Copenhagen interpretation? Thank you.
So for me, in brief, in the usual Copenhagen interpretation, at least as a Weizsäcker, he would view the probabilities that one uses in physics in an objective way. There is a right probability assignment, and there are many wrong probability assignments. The point of view of Definiti is, before the event, before a measurement occurs, there is no such thing as a right probability. And this goes so far as to say probability 1 is not right. Probability being right or wrong is something that is declared, only in some cases after the fact, but never before the fact, and that's the key distinction.
Yes, Chris, I would like to start with your Whitehead quote you gave about the throbs of existence.
You used it in your talk yesterday.
Yes, but Whitehead says drops of existence, and I think that's a very big difference because Whitehead is known for his knowledge of literature. He uses his words very well. Talking about drops of existence, of course, implies that there is sort of an isolated entity from something, from a context. And I bring this in context with sort of this status which is given to the subject. Of course, coming from the humanities, I find it great that the subject finds entrance into physics, but this image of the subject as something like a closed entity who decides on his or herself what to do, of course, that's an image of the subject which goes back to Enlightenment and which in philosophy, in the humanities and cultural studies, in sociology, you will not find it anymore there.
Correct.
So my question would be, do you need this concept, which is sort of far behind what's going on in other disciplines for the sort of plausibility of the formula, or why do you use this concept?
So I would say that every cartoon I draw is provisional. It's a project. And for instance, I'm quite attracted, I wish I could repeat the quote for you, but there's somewhere in James's 1895 or 1890 psychology book where he says, I define the self in the widest possible sense. A man is not only his physical body and his thoughts, but also his clothes and his wallet and his wife and his children, his yacht and his lands, I believe. So the cartoon that you saw of this isolated entity called the agent or the self, I think is just a provisional kind of move. Where it will go in the end, I don't know. But just a brief note, I have seen throbs of experience, and I think I'm relatively scholarly. I've also seen drops of experience. So I'll make a bet with you, and maybe I'll lose it. But I would bet that we can find both phrases in the corpus of Whitehead.
Okay.
And we'll find at least one of them, and we might find both.
Okay, I quoted it.
And if I lose, I buy you a beer.
Oh, I copied it from Process and Reality. So at least there's one version where he says drops of experience. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. In the back, that'll be the last question in the back.
Okay, this question is for all the panel. If one believes that consciousness is fundamentally going to be explained in purely physical terms, then obviously quantum mechanics, given the nature of quantum mechanics, describing the world in microscopic level, clearly must underpin consciousness in some way. But how does one make the leap from the microscopic quantum level to the more brain scale consciousness level? How does one make that kind of conceptual leap?
Well, the view that I hold on this is that consciousness is not to do with the quantum level. And this is the view that Stuart and I have tried to develop. It has to do with how when things get too big. You see, the quantum level, if you're talking about individual particles or small quantum systems, small systems, physical systems, small in the sense of not very much mass, then they behave extremely precisely according to quantum mechanics, let's say the Schrödinger equation. It's extremely precise. The only trouble is that when you get big enough, that it's what's called making a measurement, but making a measurement involves wheeling in some piece of apparatus which is much larger than the stuff you're measuring. And so you have to consider the whole system, which includes the piece of apparatus. And then you find that you are driven to these probabilities, and it's not just following the Schrödinger equation. So the U that I described in my talk was following the Schrödinger equation. And that works beautifully as long as you don't have huge displacements of mass. And what huge means is not very big from our perspective, it's very big from the quantum particles perspective. Now then the argument is that at that level, when you start having two large masses being displaced, it does not follow the Schrödinger equation, but it does what people use when they make measurements, which is the R process in what I was describing. And that's when the wave function gets collapsed. And yeah, it's a huge puzzle. Quantum mechanics works beautifully well with seemingly no corrections needed and with extraordinary precision, as long as you're talking about displacements of things which don't come to too big a level. So the idea here in the scheme that Stuart and I follow is that in microtubules, you have not just in a single one, that's not enough. That's too small a level. You don't get the reduction of the state, single ones. But if you've got lots of these things acting in some kind of concert over large areas of the brain, well, they do get to the level where the mass displacement becomes significant. And then you've got to worry about the collapse to one state or another. Now, it's in that collapse that the element of proto-consciousness comes in. It's not prior to that. It's not at the quantum level. And it's not when you've got things behaving essentially classically at that level. It's at the borderline between the two. So if you like, in my picture of the mermaid, it is the mermaid. It's not the sea underneath. It's not the scenery above. It's the connection between the two. It's how the quantum world emerges into the classical world. And that requires something that we don't have in quantum mechanics, a proper theory which describes the collapse of the quantum state. And the argument that we're making is that the element of proto-consciousness comes about exactly at that moment when one has to collapse the wave function. It is the collapse of the wave function. And that collapse can involve quite a large area of the brain. It doesn't have to be localized, and it's not likely to be localized in a single microtubule. That's much too small. You need to have lots of them, and they could be spread over big regions. So that's the perspective that we have.
Yeah. Billions of tubulins, nanograms of protein, I think. Very briefly, we're over time, just 30 seconds each, and see if we can finish this up, please.
I'm a neurosurgeon, and I have real difficulty in understanding the quantum mechanics. I would like to go some basics, and I would like to take your definitions on consciousness and mind in the most simplest terms. But the main requirement of mine is I need some help to understand. Every day I'm making operations and I am changing to human brains, and I'm asking myself if this human brain is creating consciousness or this brain is created by consciousness. I would like to take your opinion on these definitions.
I'm not quite sure I see the... I mean, the point of view I'm holding with Stuart is that consciousness arises in this physical process which is outside our current understanding of quantum mechanics. This is the collapse. What is it that causes the quantum state to collapse? And that is something happening within our brain. It's not, do you say the brain is causing it, or do you say it's causing the brain? It's what happens, and I don't like to say one is causing the other. I mean, it's part of the brain. It's the brain's action which depends upon these processes, and that's, I don't like thinking of it in terms of somehow something external to the brain or something. It's within the brain. It's part of the activity of the brain according to the theory which goes beyond current quantum mechanics and which encompasses the collapse of the quantum state as part of this extended theory. We don't have that theory as yet. I personally, the view that we hold is that this happens because of a conflict between Einstein's general theory of relativity and quantum mechanics. And you start to see a real tension between these two theories, and you can see that already. That's not controversial. That tension is something which can be resolved by the collapse. How that happens is not yet understood, but at least that tension is there. And to say that it's the brain causing it, well, it's part of the brain's action. I'm not quite sure how you say that. If you include what the microtubules do, okay, then but then it's the consciousness comes about as part of that process.
So may I just quickly comment that I think that there's a certain very vague similarity between the left-hand interpretation and the right-hand interpretation on this count.
I keep worrying about which is left and which is right, because the audience...
You're to my left.
On the audience, I'm on the right-hand side.
And I'm on the right, and of course Thomas is stuck in the middle. But
Okay.
this relates to the previous question and this one. From the point of view over here, consciousness is associated usually with something that uses quantum theory. I'm thinking of quantum theory as an instance of decision theory. And just as you cannot derive the notion of the user of decision theory, suppose it's conscious, you're not going to derive that from decision theory itself. You're not going to derive consciousness from quantum theory in my point of view either. So you won't derive consciousness in quantum theory. You need consciousness to cause collapse.
No, we don't need that.
Yes, no.
That's Copenhagen.
That's not our view, I think. Yeah.
That's not our view.
Yeah.
Well,
Collapse causes
you're
consciousness.
consciousness. You're proto-consciousness.
That's happening everywhere. We don't need consciousness to cause that.
Okay, well, I've also got things happening everywhere. But I would have said it like this, that I can't look at the formalism of quantum theory on this point of view. Forget the similarities, maybe there are none. I can't get it from quantum theory because it presupposes the user of quantum theory.
Yeah, we certainly agree that current quantum theory does not encompass consciousness. I mean, that's what we're saying. We have to go beyond current.
So there is that much similarity then. We do agree on
Yes,
that.
okay, yes.
I would just tell my neurosurgeon colleague, take care of your patient's microtubules and talk to your anesthesiologist. Real briefly, two more, and let's wrap it up.
I'll try to be quick. A question for Roger. I wonder how understanding does not need further validation. You know, I got the chess piece. It award my biology. I felt it. Okay, I get it. It's a draw. But how so? This does not further validation, understanding as a whole, because you know maybe somebody cannot understand it, and what is the mechanism for not understanding versus understanding? It's really health of microtubules or what else? So if you can expand a bit in short about understanding and to what is referred to.
But the question is, how does understanding come about from these elementary proto-conscious events? Well, it needs a theory. We see, it's what I'm saying is somewhat negative. The statement is that understanding, as far as I can see, and I think the arguments are strong, that understanding does something which is not following a computation, and that there is something deeper which gives us a selective advantage over creatures which perhaps have somewhat less understanding, and that understanding is a feature which allows us, I mean, the proto-conscious elements have to be somehow, I mean, that's what the orc part of orc-OR is. It's got to be orchestrated. It can't be just an individual event which has no meaning to it. It could go one way or the other, and it's just a probability. But if it's part of a bigger system, like the orchestra, I think Stuart talks about, and you've got much bigger structure, which fits in terms. I mean, it's not a random process, is the idea. There's something deeper. I mean, quantum mechanics just gives you a probability. So the argument is it's not exact. It looks like a probability in isolation, but when it's combined with other things, it's something which behaves in a way which is not simply random and which has some content to it, which involves whatever understanding is. Now, I don't know what understanding is. There's a lot of don't knows in this argument, but it's a kind of negative argument which says that, okay, understanding is something other than a computational process, and we see in the laws of physics up to this point only computational processes. So you see in the physical laws, Newtonian mechanics, in general relativity, in Maxwell's equations, even in the Schrödinger equation, you see something which simply follows a computational process. So if there's something in physics which goes outside that or goes beyond it, the place to look is in where quantum mechanics doesn't go quite right. When I say quantum mechanics, the trouble is that people interpret quantum mechanics, I think my colleagues on left, right, which is the left-hand side of the audience, are taking the probability aspect of the theory as much more basic than I am. You see, I regard the probability aspect as somewhat secondary. That the basic thing is how the evolution takes place according to unitary evolution, according to quantum mechanics, the Schrödinger equation. And these things is where you see this extraordinary precision in the way the theory operates. When you get outside that, you just have probability measures in the collapse of the wave function. We need a better theory there, and that better theory would lead to some comprehension of what's involved in understanding things. And I think that's a huge leap. We're certainly not anywhere there yet.
Okay, thank you.
Last question.
This is a proposition for the panel to comment on, okay? So I would say that if we consider the word now for the now moment, yeah, we could perhaps put a cognitive now in one category, a mathematical now as in t in the short, in the wave function, a physical now in the sense of what kind of now we're measuring when we entangle two photons by spontaneous down conversion, for example, you know, because there is light and there is light traveling, and we say that these photons are entangled because they may happen here or here in different crystals. Yeah, so those photons we measure because they're close to each other in correlation. It's what we call entanglement. Yeah, so that's the physics time, very small. And then there is another kind of now, which I'm going to propose, has to do with the development of a soul. The cognitive processes, the mind and the soul, are going to be shaping the cognitive processes. So the way I perceive the now in the jungle maybe 5,000 years ago, if I can translate myself there, would be the tiger is coming. That's my immediate boundary after the now. The tiger's coming. It's in the past now. I look for an alternative over there. If I forget about the tiger to be in the now, in the mathematical now, I'm dead. So that cognitive moment is different. If I'm an enlightened person, I may talk to the tiger and appease the tiger. That's a completely different cognitive now. So my question is, wouldn't it be appropriate to just differentiate the categories between the nows that we're talking about, from the decision analyst point of view or from the experimentalist in the quantum physics lab? You're characterizing a utility function here. You're trying to measure an eigenvalue here. And the probability tree, it's dynamically changing in terms of quantum mechanics, unless you change the probability tree of the decision maker, the subjective probabilities, moment by moment. So there are relationships here, and there are different kinds of now. That's my proposal.
I think now is the time we end the session.
Great.
Let's thank our speakers and a great audience. You guys have been awesome hanging out here. Concurrent sessions begin at 5 p.m. Then I think there's a poster session, and then I think Harold's buying drinks for some people. So thank you all. See you at the concurrents and posters. Thank the panel.